Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Stephen Wertheim, who's a senior fellow in the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the author of Tomorrow the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy in World War II. And he has an article in Foreign Affairs, Biden the Realist. The president's foreign policy doctrine has been hiding in plain sight. Welcome to Background Briefing, Stephen Wertheim.
It's a pleasure to join you.
So in terms of Biden's foreign policy hiding in plain sight, there was an expectation, of course, that America would swing back to its sort of more traditional foreign policy after the chaos and amateurism of the Trump 4 years of the Trump wrecking crew, if you will. So in terms of his foreign policy doctrine hiding in plain sight, which we obviously want to talk to you further about, but just vis-a-vis the Europeans and NATO, what do you make of these tensions? Are they real? I keep reading about them, and I'm not quite sure. Some people defend what Biden's doing, and others suggest that he somehow irritated the Europeans, particularly with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I'm wondering whether that ties into the fact that he's more pragmatic than even the Europeans thought he would be.
Well, I think it's real that in some European capitals there is upset about Biden's decision to withdraw and the consequences that have come with that withdrawal. That said, I am skeptical that fallout over the end of the war in Afghanistan will be a major factor impacting transatlantic relations going forward. I don't really see signs that this issue will spur Europe to take, in and of itself, will spur Europe to take a substantially more autonomous path in its own security affairs. And it's worth noting that although there were some quite elaborate calls, denunciations of Biden coming from the British Parliament in particular, over 20 years, America's NATO allies had the opportunity to be more active in the war in Afghanistan. They could have replaced the U.S. force if they felt that strongly about it. And they didn't really have the will to do that. So I expect these tensions to be papered over.
And of course, the criticisms coming from the Republicans are pretty hollow, given that these are the same people, in effect, who were practicing what Einstein considered to be a definition of insanity, which is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome. And that's 20 years of doing that in Afghanistan.
Indeed. It was really troubling to hear so many prominent politicians and even commentators who aren't necessarily Republican aligned suggest that the war in Afghanistan was sustainable, was of low cost. Sustainable for whom? For the United States, that was pouring in trillions of dollars into this war. Was it sustainable for the service members who made the ultimate sacrifice? Was it sustainable for the thousands and thousands of Afghan civilians and soldiers who were losing their lives in this war? And by the way, the casualty rate among Afghans had been increasing of late. The numbers were not going down. So this was an unsustainable war. And I think now the challenge for the United States, for Americans as a whole, is to try to come to terms with what is quite a grievous loss in the war.
And of course, the fact that the Afghans were suffering such huge casualties is a lot to do with the dreadful deal that Trump made. I mean, for all that talk about the art of the deal, the guy was a complete idiot as far as making deals. He got rolled by Erdogan, he got rolled by Putin on every occasion, and Xi Jinping rolled him, and even I think Kim Jong-un did to some extent. So the idea that he made a deal with the Taliban that you guys can go ahead and beat the hell out of the Afghan army, but just you can't shoot at Americans. And it was hardly a surprise that the Taliban took over. But one of the things you point out in your article at Foreign Affairs Stephen Wertheim, which I think is worth noting here, and that is that in 1991, Biden opposed the Gulf War, which was very popular at the time. That certainly is surprising. And then, of course, later, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, he became much more hawkish on enlarging NATO. But that vote back in 1991 was a pretty unpopular vote, wasn't it? I seem to recall there was a great deal of jingoism associated with the Gulf War. It was the first big television war. It sort of put CNN on the map.
That's right. And at the time, Joe Biden asked, to quote him, "What vital interests of the United States justify sending Americans to their deaths in the sands of Saudi Arabia?" End quote. It rings a bell with what he's been saying about Afghanistan in his series of defenses of his decision to withdraw, when he's been stark that the only purpose for U.S. combat in Afghanistan was to go after the terrorists who attacked the United States on 9/11. He rejected outright the very objective that the United States should try to build a new Western-style democratic state in Afghanistan. And so that's why my co-author and I wrote this with Josh Schifrinson, a professor at Boston University. We wanted to understand where this was coming from in Biden's makeup, and that vote against the Gulf War in 1991 is notable, but it's also worth saying that perhaps due to the popularity of that war in the United States, Biden shifted quickly thereafter. He actually recanted his opposition to the Gulf War and distinguished himself as an advocate of the expansion of NATO as well as U.S. military intervention, particularly in support of Bosnians in the war coming out of the collapse of Yugoslavia.
And again, I'm speaking with Stephen Wertheim, who's a senior fellow in the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the author of Tomorrow the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy in World War II. And he has an article at Foreign Affairs, Biden, the Realist, the President's Foreign Policy Doctrine has been hiding in plain sight. So give us a quick sketch of what you mean, Stephen, about Biden's foreign policy doctrine hiding in plain sight.
Well, I would say that Biden has shown an orientation toward pragmatism and toward realism that might be a bit surprising given the way he was perceived on the campaign and even given some of the things he said on the campaign and as president. He seemed to be promising, at least in the eyes of many, on the campaign trail to stand for a restoration of the status quo anti-Trump in U.S. foreign policy, a return to the kind of pursuit of liberal hegemony across the world that the United States has defined itself through since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he's surrounded himself with well-seasoned advisors. And yet, listening to Biden decide to withdraw from Afghanistan and defend that decision, it's striking that there's something else going on, that actually Biden, for at least the past 15 years, has become a skeptic of what he described recently as major military operations to remake other countries, first in Iraq and then in Afghanistan. And he's been hiding in plain sight, in a sense, because a lot of this information has been known for a while, and yet an anti-war reputation hasn't been attached to Joe Biden. So Joe Biden in 2006, when the so-called surge of U.S. forces in Iraq was first put forward, blasted that idea, and he opposed the surge there. And then as vice president under Barack Obama, he was the foremost opponent of the surge of U.S. troops to pursue a counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan. He advocated only a narrow counterterrorism mission, and at least according to the memoirs of Richard Holbrooke, a U.S. envoy at the time to Afghanistan and Pakistan, he wanted to leave the war in Afghanistan altogether.
Well, in fact, Holbrooke actually had a much more holistic approach. He wanted to deal with Kashmir first. In other words, if you deal with Kashmir, which is not easy by any stretch of the imagination, you deal with the tension between Pakistan and Afghanistan, which is at the heart of Pakistan's strategy to stab the United States in the back, because they believe that India is meddling in their backyard on their other flank. And of course, that went nowhere. And as you point out, Biden was even yelling in these meetings, I'm not sending my boy back there to risk his life on behalf of women's rights. Well, that's not going to go down very well with a lot of people out there, wouldn't you say?
Well, it depends who you ask. If you take Afghanistan, it has been absolutely tragic to see people trying to flee the country as the Taliban has took over, and to think about what might happen to a whole generation of Afghan girls who were in cities like Kabul, who were able to get an education and now have their future in jeopardy. At the same time, the war was killing many Afghan women and girls and men in the countryside, in a country that is overwhelmingly non-urban. And so I think part of Biden's view, although it's interesting that he didn't emphasize the humanitarian aspect when he has given his speeches defending his decision to withdraw, I think, part of what defenders of his decision to withdraw would say would be that although the war had some positive effects for some urban Afghan women and girls, it had profoundly negative effects for others in the countryside, and that helps to explain, I think, why Afghans in the countryside ultimately were receptive to the Taliban coming back into power after 2 decades.
Sure, and you see the clash now between the urban and the rural, as these rural Taliban hicks, if you will, confronted by women in Kabul and an educated younger generation who just simply don't want to go back to the 7th century. So it's not entirely clear that the Taliban are going to have a comfortable time, although they could, of course, resort to incredible repression, which they're perfectly capable of. But just in the last few minutes, Stephen, is there an element here where when Biden said he doesn't want to send our boys to risk their lives, his own son, of course, Bo, served in Iraq, do you think he got a lot of his input from his son and others who reflect the attitude of the actual men and women on the front lines? They usually have a very different perspective on these wars than the Pentagon has. The Pentagon, of course, is so tied in with contractors and this massive defense budget, which is reaching record levels, $778 billion for fiscal 2022. They're perfectly happy to leave billions of dollars worth of equipment behind in Afghanistan because that gets replaced and that's more money for them. So, an old friend of mine, Colonel David Hackworth, who was the most decorated U.S. soldier, both in Korea and Vietnam, used to talk about how the military-industrial complex it's all about the toys and not about the boys. Do you think that Biden was getting more influence from the boys as opposed to the toys?
Such an important point you've made. I do think that Biden certainly invokes his son, Bo, frequently. I think that's probably sincere. And I think Biden has been a politician consistently attentive to public opinion, not just the opinion of rank and file service members and veterans who strongly supported ending America's involvement in the war in Afghanistan, but also the public as a whole. And the public, it's remarkable to me in a recent Washington Post ABC News survey, 77% of the American public supported the withdrawal, even as most were displeased with the execution of the withdrawal. So I think this is part of Biden's consistent pragmatism. He tries to respond to where the country is and stay within the mainstream. And I think that in this case has led him to decisively end the war in Afghanistan. It also raises a question, though, about the wider war on terror, because that war on terror remains intact, and there is less public pressure to cease aerial strikes via drones or commando raids, which the United States is now quite routinely conducting across a significant arc of the earth.
Well, that's the debate that we should be having, isn't it, Stephen? The guns and butter debate. I mean, it's never made any sense to fill potholes in Kabul and not in Main Street, USA. And if all we're doing is having special forces all around the world and using drones, it's hard to justify this massive military budget. I mean, during the Cold War, we spent much less, and the Soviet Union could have destroyed us in 30 minutes.
That's right. And I think going forward, it will be interesting to see the extent to which the Biden administration makes material changes to the U.S. force posture in the world that deliver on its stated desire to focus on competition with China, with Russia being a secondary competitor, and to pivot away from the greater Middle East. In a sense, it's been more than a decade since U.S. leaders expressed that a pivot to Asia was appropriate. And yet when you pivot to something, that means you're pivoting from something else. And the pivot away from the greater Middle East hasn't happened. Biden's decision to end the war in Afghanistan suggests he may be more serious than his predecessors about effectuating such a pivot. He's ordered a global posture review to be completed by the Department of Defense. That's ongoing. So the events around Afghanistan, I think, make it more interesting what Biden will decide to do going forward.
Well, Stephen Wertheim, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much.
And again, I've been speaking with Stephen Wertheim, who's a senior fellow in the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the author of Tomorrow the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy in World War II. And he has an article in Foreign Affairs, Biden the Realist, the President's Foreign Policy Doctrine has been hiding in plain sight. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back looking into today's Republican Party as the party